Welcome to the show, Veronica.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am delighted to jump into this topic of social diffusion of environmental behaviors. It actually comes up, I think, with every single environmental psychologist expert I have on the show, because it seems to be that the way that environmental behaviors are transferred is largely from person to person. And we can't avoid this fundamental fact that is how our behaviors and knowledge and social norms spread. But the first question I ask everybody on the show is, what is the problem with our entire profession, our entire community of environmental engineers, environmental scientists, climate managers, sustainability managers, recycling managers, this carbon reporting inventory people, like this huge industry we have of environmental professionals. And it feels most of the time, I think, perhaps it is, that nobody has ever heard of environmental psychology or even really like behavior design, or even just really thinks that human psychology is even like a thing that we have to work with. Like, why is this a problem for us?
This is something that I've struggled with through my academic career. I didn't even know that environmental psychology existed until I got to grad school, where I realized that that's what I wanted to really study. And it's such an issue because for a long time, people have been designing behavior change campaigns and environmental initiatives around this kind of misconception that if you tell people information, or you're sharing facts, or you're educating someone, people are automatically going to change their behavior. And we've kind of seen time and time again that this isn't necessarily what gets people to change their behavior or to take action in a pro-environmental way. This can definitely help. This is part of the equation. It can help influence some of the perceptions around these behaviors. But something else that's important is that humans are super complex. We can't just turn on a couple buttons or switch and say, oh, if we just do this and this, people will automatically get onto this path of doing this action. And so we really need to rely on the social science research that has been done, not only in the environmental world, but a lot of these things are coming from other fields like public health, communication, all of these different fields that have incorporated social science more so in their initiatives. For some reason, there's just this disconnect with the environmental field, I feel like. Another important thing is that if we're not taking humans into account when we're designing programs, we might not actually hit on all of the things that different distinct groups of people are actually going to need in order to change behavior or to join some sort of social movement. So it's actually more exclusive. It's not really an inclusive way to do things if you're just going off of kind of your own biases and misconceptions about how humans behave. So yes, humans behave in many different ways, but if you're actually using social science that has interviewed people, that has run psychological studies, you're going to be able to create initiatives that actually take in what is important for actually changing that behavior. And I can kind of restate that. It's really just that including diverse perspectives and including well-studied theory on human nature and human behavior is going to be important for making more effective programs and initiatives around the environment.
I love it how you put it in this inclusive concept, because most of the people who are environmental professionals have come from a science or engineering background. They are usually good, critical, rational thinkers and able to take a fairly intellectual, data-driven approach to their worldview and in taking in data. And so when they read a climate change report or look at some data or look at some air pollution data, it's like, hey, look at these facts. Obviously, these facts matter. And this is the whole idea, that scientific facts persuade people. These scientific facts matter to me. So therefore, if I go and tell everybody the same scientific facts, then everybody's gonna do it. But the thing is that everybody comes from really different backgrounds, really different levels of education, really different things that motivate them. Like some people are just not that motivated by scientific facts. You're like sort of environmental science, environmental engineering, PhD, little tiny slither, like of society is not representative of the whole. And people are motivated by so many different things. So instead of just leading to blaming capitalism and big oil and greed and selfishness, which such like a cop out to come up with that as your causality, we really need to understand, well, how does the human animal work when you're not an environmental scientist or an engineer, and you can just read a climate report and suddenly be like super motivated for the rest of your life, like the other kind of like 99%. And that's kind of like really where this environmental psychology comes in. And I think it's like I think there is there's an unconscious assumption in the whole, and we're not even really aware of this unconscious assumption that environmental facts will lead to change. Like it's such an implicit sort of bias in the way that we think. We don't even realize that it's actually like a hypothesis. Do you know what I mean? When sorry, go on.
No, that's how I got into the field. I said I want to be an environmental educator. I want to teach people so that they can do this too, so that they're as passionate about it as I am. But it's just it's more complex than that. And I do still believe it's an important part of the equation. But like what you do, there's all of these different theories that you can draw on to really help design behavior change campaigns and initiatives that draw on the unconscious things like social influence that are going to affect how people behave, whether or not they believe it or they think that it's happening to them. Because a lot of the time people will say, well, no, tell me what to do. Tell me how to do it and I will do it. And I'm like, well, I want to tell you how to do it, but you also need to feel like you're supported by your community and that you have a sense of confidence that you are able to do it. And if you do it, it's going to make a difference. There's all these other things coming in to play rather than just the information.
And it's amazingly complex. Like I was just reading your paper, just being like, oh my God, like trying to get my head around like how nuanced and how complex the human psychology is around that. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to reflect on what you said about that a lot of this social science coming into environment is coming from other fields. And a lot of us, we've only ever worked in the field of water or clean energy or solar or energy efficiency in buildings or whatever. And we don't realize how far behavior design and psychology design and technology design, how far ahead it is in other fields. Like I live in Silicon Valley and have been part of this startup, kind of like hacker computer science startup scene for the last 10 years. And like, I am just like constantly gobsmacked at just about the massive chasm there is between the way Silicon Valley style of it's software design, and software design is kind of also behavior design as well, that kind of user interface design, and just being able to put together software prototypes, how we go into apps. And then I come back to my environmental traditional world and I'm just like, oh my God, we are so in the dark ages. So it's just a little bit of just a nugget to think of, that while we're thinking of this behavior design and this psychology design, this stuff is like totally taken off in other fields, like in advertising and film, like in just like you said, in like public health, there's a lot of behavioral science. Like this is normal stuff to think about in like every like day-to-day working life in other industries. We're just trying to like sort of bring it to our earthy world. But let's like take a dive into your research paper. What was the big lesson, the big aha kind of insight that you got out of this paper?
I think the biggest takeaway, I think maybe there are two takeaways. One is more theoretical, and I think the other is more actionable. I would say that the one thing that we did that a lot of papers aren't really doing is specifically trying to see if there are distinct drivers of or motivations for diffusion behavior, social diffusion. And again, I'll just say our definition is an action in which you are kind of spreading some sort of information or some sort of behavior through a social network. So that diffusion behavior could just be having a conversation. It could be teaching a course. There are different types of social diffusion behavior, but we're wondering if the drivers of that behavior are distinct from the drivers of individual behavior. So something that you do on your own, something that doesn't necessarily require interacting with other humans. Are there different things that drive those two types of behavior? Do they overlap? Or do you really need to be specific when you are designing a campaign for a specific type of behavior? So with that one, we found that yes, there are things that are distinct in the two types of behavior. Studies have shown that social influence plays a huge role in individual behavior. There's utility companies using what we would call normative messaging. So it's saying like, hey, your most efficient neighbors are using this much energy. That's a way to kind of signal to other people that the people around you are doing this, maybe you should lower your energy. But for social diffusion behavior, it seems like efficacy, which is a term that we talk about in the paper, I like to think of it as confidence. So your confidence in your ability to do something is actually what is driving social diffusion. So your confidence in your ability to have a conversation with somebody. And that sounds so simple, but I think a lot of the times we forget that like having a conversation actually has a lot of, you're interacting with someone else. So there's a possibility that somebody could react negatively. And there's a possibility that like somebody might not agree with what you're saying. And so kind of building up people's confidence in having these conversations maybe is a lot more important for that type of behavior rather than building up somebody's confidence in their ability to take shorter showers or recycle. So that was a kind of distinct behavior motivator that we found. I think that's the biggest preliminary evidence we have that I'd love to see further experimental research on to see if you do really need to target different perceptions for the different two types of behavior. And of course, there are other types of behavior that would fall more in the civic action realm, like voting or protesting. And so we're really trying to see if we can further pinpoint the specific motivators for those different behaviors that kind of run along this scale of individual action to group collective action. And so, and kind of the main takeaway is that efficacy piece seems to be a little more important for social diffusion behavior rather than what we kind of were assuming from the research on individual behavior that social influence would be. And of course, social influence plays a role in individual behavior, and your perceptions around individual behavior affect how you actually go out and spread that behavior. So I'll kind of put it into the example of our paper. We were interested in how to get people to encourage others to plant native plants. So plant plants that are ecologically adapted to your area, which has a whole range of benefits for both the environment and for humans. And then we're also looking at this behavior of native plant gardening yourself. So those are the two behaviors that we were interested in. And so your knowledge of planting native plants yourself and your attitude towards them. So if you think native plants are great and they're really important, that is also going to affect your motivation to go out and tell somebody. And again, this doesn't sound groundbreaking, but it's the little pieces of psychology that you really have to think about when you're designing a campaign. So you can't just tell somebody, here's a native plant, here's how you plant it, now go tell other people what to plant. It's actually more like, hey, we give you this baseline of information of how to do it. How are you actually going to have that conversation with someone? What's going to be like your starting of the conversation? Who are you going to reach out to. These little step-by-step ways to make people feel confident in their ability to go out and talk to somebody about maybe a subject that they think is highly politicized or is not going to be accepted by others. It's those little steps that we need to think about when we're designing for social diffusion.
So from what I gathered from the study was this real differentiator in this idea of self-efficacy. And I think you call it, I've got it written down here, diffusion specific self-efficacy. But from what I gathered, it's all about this, which is a little bit more nuanced than just the concept of diffusion, right? Because when you think about diffusion, we're just thinking about like, okay, people just like affect everybody. Like they could be affect everybody just by like norms, by just by look, everybody's wearing a pink t-shirt. I'll wear more pink t-shirts. It's in fashion. They're seeing stuff on Instagram. Maybe you just like sort of tell people like, go and like talk to your neighbors. It's very generic. But from what I could gather is that this concept of efficacy is really this sort of like modulator of just like of how much people will go and talk to other people around them. And it's not just giving them instructions, that self-efficacy is, and I actually copied this, I should just ask you, but I've written it down here, the belief that one's actions will influence other. And that's the real nuance that we want to kind of dive into, right? In this topic, in your research, in this conversation, is we need to get good at empowering people to do diffusion, which is like talking and influencing other people, not just be like, hey, tell your friends about it. Like really, really empower people in like, okay, like how are we going to get somebody to like have conversations, talk to people, do it? Can you just talk a bit more about like self-efficacy as this whole concept and as this modulating effect, and like how we can really like get into this on the ground?
So the paper dives into multiple types of efficacy, so it does get very jargony and confusing, but self-efficacy, I think, is the one that some people have heard of, especially if you're in the education world. Self-efficacy is a huge, and I like to think of it as your confidence in your ability to take action or achieve some sort of goal. And so there is a lot of research on self-efficacy. It's just not necessarily as common in the environmental literature. And so if you look at education and you look at social cognitive theory like Albert Bandura, you are going to see that there are a lot of strategies to improve somebody's sense of self-efficacy. And so I have a little list right here so that I don't forget. Wow, where'd it go? There we go. So one strategy that you could use in the real world for improving somebody's self-efficacy in social diffusion would be to actually have them set goals and set small, achievable, SMART goals. And so we've tested this in studies past this. But so setting goals like, all right, who am I going to reach out to? Who am I going to share my coupon with? That was a part of our study. It was our real world measure of this diffusion action, is sharing a coupon to give somebody else the chance to buy and plant a native plant. So who am I going to share it with? When am I going to share it with them? What is my opening? Like, I'm going to set a goal to create my opening line of like, okay, my neighbor John loves vegetable gardening. So I'm going to craft like the hook of like, hey, your vegetable garden looks great. Have you heard of native plant gardening? And other strategies include social modeling, which is actually giving people an example of somebody else doing it. So that might, for social diffusion of native plant gardening specifically, that might be somebody actually having this conversation in front of you. So having two people interacting of like that same conversation of your neighbor who loves vegetable gardening and seeing that interaction happen, letting people practice themselves and be successful. So that would be something like putting people into partners in some sort of workshop and letting them practice their opening lines on each other, and then having a positive reaction from the other person. And then just kind of step-by-step scaffolding that I've kind of been alluding to this whole time, of like breaking it up piece by piece. And that sounds so silly because we have conversations all the time, but actually getting people to talk about something specific, something that they might think that they are the only one that thinks this way, and that other people might not either believe them or hold the same values as them. It's actually really hard. From what my studies have been showing me, is that it's really hard to get people to talk to each other, especially I think in the United States, with this huge culture of individualism, and I don't want to tell other people what to do. So I think empowering people to know that they can they can reach out to people, and they kind of have a step-by-step guide of how to do it, not just what to say or not just what the facts are.
Because it seems to me like this is a whole kind of area of design that almost like hasn't been invented yet. Like imagine if you were, say, for example, like you're working with like a city or a not-for-profit. I mean, maybe there are people that do this professionally and I just like haven't met them yet. And your job was specifically to get groups of people together and really, really dive into this nuance of how to design all these things that you just mentioned, like helping people who are already, they've stood up to perhaps be part of this group, that already sort of a more advanced environmental person, to how do you set up goals for people to reach out to people? How do you help create the list? How do you make like the little flow chart of steps you need to take? How do you like create a script? Like what sort of scripts work best for reaching out to people? Like you said with the garden, do you use a compliment? Is that a great way to open something? Like, hey, like say something nice. And almost like packaging it up and designing it and like practicing it. Like if this was your job, this was your profession, to do only this and to master this whole process. And also like the buddying system. We have this thing called Cool Block here in Mountain View where I live, which is like a block leader, like sustainability program. And they have some really amazing wins for it. It's really, really powerful how well it can work if you get like a person to kind of like stand up and sort of be the leader and like and take charge. But I signed up for it just when I newly moved here. And I'm one of those people who just really likes to be like well networked and kind of do things as a group. And I like to join all the sort of groups in my area and stuff. And what Full Block didn't do, which I think was a real failing of it, and hopefully they'll start to do that, is they didn't buddy me with anybody who'd already done it before. And I felt it's kind of like really weird and sort of lost and alone. And like, what am I to like just go and like door knock on strangers' houses? Maybe if you've already like know all your neighbors and you've lived there for 10 years and you own your own house, that might feel more natural. But I didn't really feel like that. And I just thought if I was just with a group of just like 5 or 10 other people and I had been buddied, I'd do something. And what actually happened is that I had a friend who's a real estate agent, and real estate agents are really into door-to-door canvassing. It's part of their marketing techniques. And she's like, oh, this is great. I'll take you out. We'll go around. And honestly, the only reason why I started it was because I had this really extroverted kind of door-to-door hardened sales. So I kind of like got buddied just like inadvertently, not through their program, but just through my own social network. But that buddying was like the only reason why I got activated to do something that I was already really wanted to do. But so that just like idea of just putting 2 people together that maybe one's a bit more experienced, and so they have that kind of that social bond and that kind of like accountability, is just like what if that's like the secret ingredient to making all these campaigns work, is like helping like put people together, like one environmental psychologist, one designer, and one engineer. It's like you put the 3 together and then like all the stuff will start working. Like there's just these little ingredients that it just seems like if they're missing, like it's not going to work. But anyway, just a little anecdote of my personal experience. Now,
and I just want to add that this block, I'm forgetting what the name you said,
Cool Block.
but that's Cool Block. That is building off of the block leader approach, or what we call relational organizing, which is a form of social diffusion, which is, I would say, one of the most effective strategies at helping change behavior is actually getting those motivated people in the community to go out into their own social network. So that is honestly the reason why we're doing this work, is because there was a meta-analysis that said by Abraham C. and Stegg that block leader approach, we looked at all of these different experimental studies, and the block leader approach kept showing up as the number one most effective. So we're really trying to dig into, okay, we have these block leaders, but how do you get more block leaders? How do you influence those people that may not already be the ones that are doing this in their community, but maybe there's people that would like to, they just don't know how. Maybe it is buddying them up with that extroverted person that's already doing it.
Or just putting extra hand holding, like extra working on the program. I saw that also in the paper, I had it highlighted. 29 people said that the block leader approach was the most effective way to spread conservation behaviors. So that's true.
I think it was 29 studies in a meta-analysis.
29 studies. And I had this really I had this sort of like a lightning bolt moment, which is when I was reading your paper, it was like, it's something like I kind of already know, but I find something about reading these papers just can really crystallize something that was perhaps like a little bit fuzzy before. And a lot of people ask me, because I'm going around talking about environmental behavior design all the time, and they say there are all these criticisms people have, like, we've got to stop giving people top green tips, stop telling people to turn the lights off and ride the bike. We need big systems change. It's kind of like hatred at these like smaller green tips. Or like, we're only just holding events and they're just for the converted. We're just like the same people talking to the same people all the time, which is another thing that happens. But I was looking at it and I was like, oh my God, this is so clear and obvious. You need to design a split program. If you're doing anything environmentally, you design one program to activate individual people that you want to be social influence leaders. And this stage, you are looking for the converted. You are looking for the deep green people. Even when my work that I've done pitching to utilities, because the software and the concepts I design tend to really lean towards more like deeper environmental people. I'm kind of not doing like the super lightweight, nobody cares stuff. And some of the utilities are like, all this is going to do is just like get to the energy nerds. Great. Another tool for just the 1% of energy nerds. And I'm like, oh, no, I believe like my work will get beyond the 1% of energy nerds. But then I thought, well, you need to have a program for that 1%. If you can get 1% of deep environmental energy nerds, and you design in detail a program to get them in, to get them active, to get them standing up, to get them to going out to 10 people each or 20 people or 100 people, and your program is entirely designed to only be a preaching to the converted program, and it is completely designed for social diffusion, for outreach, to empower those individual people. You're not trying to get these deep environmental people to teach them how to like ride the bike and switch the lights on, because we already assume that they're already doing all that stuff. And then you have one program for them, and then you have another program that would be more for the early majority type of folks who it's really only just about the actual tips. So those people might be really good for the top 10 green tips, because they're still using plastic bottles and they're still got like a bad car and they've still got a lawn, but they're kind of like psychologically open to change. So if you want to be looking at just propagating just information and tips and sort of how-tos and kind of action design, you can do that for that early majority. But it seems like we should not really be designing environmental campaigns without that concept of this split in mind, of designing the actions for the everybody, and then specifically designing for the deep green people to be like our cheerleaders, to be our get out into the community people. And those two programs and those two campaigns are going to be totally different for the two different groups.
I think it's a really powerful kind of preliminary statistic that we like to tell our participants, that people are 2 times more likely to learn information when it comes from somebody they know or somebody they feel similar to, and 10 times more likely to actually take action. And this was a couple of studies
Wait, sorry.
I don't know.
That again? What was that? I'm going to write it down.
And again, this is just preliminary from 2 studies, but people are 2 times more likely to learn scientific information when it comes from somebody they know or somebody that they feel similar to, and 10 times more likely to actually take action or change the behavior when it comes from that person that they know or they feel similar to. And I think that's so powerful, because that's something you can tell somebody who is already that deep green person, but they're like, no, like my family and friends aren't going to listen to me. I always talk about this and they don't do anything. But you are like, that person is really powerful and they don't realize it, because yes, there's scientists and experts in the field, and some people are going to listen to them because they really are passionate about that subject. But a lot of people are going to actually listen to the people around them and the people who they feel like are like them, because this sense of social influence and this trust in the people that you already know. So I think that's really powerful.
I'm totally stealing that. I'm just going to use it all the time. I'm talking to someone. I'm going to sound the benefit of me doing this podcast is that I can garner all this knowledge from people like you, and then when I'm working, I can sound really knowledgeable, and I just cherry pick all the facts from everybody. But with this though, is it the 2 times more likely to learn something scientific and 10 times more likely to take action? Is that from, what's that versus? Is that from somebody versus like a total stranger, or is it versus like an ad or a flyer? Like what is it 10 times more than what?
I would need to look back at the actual studies, but I want to say it's like compared to maybe an expert or somebody that you don't know where the information is coming from.
Okay, so it's another type of human. It's not versus like watching a video on YouTube, or like if you get like a flyer in the mail.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Let me look at the studies and I will send them to you.
Okay, we'll figure it out, because a lot of these studies test like information versus human. We had another professor on who had tested giving energy facts versus having neighbor to neighbor conversations. So one is like feedback about like just basically like a letter in the mail, like some information about your energy, versus a neighbor saying like, hey, we're doing some like energy upgrades. So it's human versus scientific literature, as opposed to how close the human is to you in that kind of distance. But
I'll look into it.
But you know what, as environmental program designers, we're so much at the beginning of getting this stuff right. Maybe the nuances don't matter that much. Do you want to just dive into a few definitions? Actually, before we go into the definitions, because that's like pretty nerdy stuff. If I'm hoping that people won't totally tune out and they will be excited to learn a whole bunch of academic definitions as much as I am. I find this like objection to studying psychology really interesting, where people say to me like, oh, like, why do you worry about like individual behavior individual action, when you need to have like sort of like the system or the government doing it for you? Sorry, you need to we need like systems change, and we need the government. An individual action can only ever change like 20%. Somebody asked me this once, was at a talk. They said, individual action has been proven to only affect 20% of impact. And maybe that's true the way that they studied it. So like, why do you even bother thinking about any of this stuff? Like, how do you answer that question?
And this is something I've heard that all around my network of like, oh, you shouldn't just focus on individual people. It's the big systems that are causing the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions, that kind of thing. And so when I'm studying it myself, I'm like, well, why am I doing this? And I do really, it's a multi-level issue that requires multi-level solutions, I guess. So yes, there are areas where governments or huge corporations are needed to take a change, like to take action. But that doesn't mean that completely disengaging from individual action is the right way to go. I think that people need to feel empowered and hopeful. And so it is kind of that first step into getting into larger environmental change, is to get people taking those individual steps. Because one, it gives them hope, and it makes people feel I'm doing something. So then maybe that leads to actually taking larger steps after that. So yes, going into your social network and encouraging other people, that social diffusion. Maybe it's voting. Maybe it's taking these individual actions that have larger consequences or larger positive impacts. And also, there is the idea that individuals working collectively can help change the way our society works. And we've seen that with other social movements all over the place, not just in the environment, but building solutions that come from the ground up to create social movements does affect how people in corporations and governments are going to behave. And also those people are incorporated in their own social systems and their own individual behaviors that are actually moving the needle towards the direction that we're trying to get to. So I think the main takeaway is that yes, you can't just look at one part of the system, because there are so many things that are overlapping and so many places that you can create interventions. And those include at the individual level, those include at a more governmental level. But in my mind, why not try to target all of those different things at once to try to create a larger initiative around whatever the environmental issue is that you are trying to focus on. So I think that individual action collectively can lead to change as well. And you're needing solutions that are both ground up and top down to create kind of the ideal future that we want to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard question to answer. Like, I've asked everybody on my podcast this question, and all you guests, I mean, these are like the experts in the field, the people who are studying this and researching it. And it's hard for everybody, I think, to answer. Everybody sort of answers like different parts of it, kind of based on their own research in their own way. I'm trying to answer it as well, and sort of putting it all together and sort of I'm learning all the time how to get more nuanced about this, about this question. I mean, what I understand from your answer is this, I mean, you didn't use this word, but I'll just throw it out at you, like a self-efficacy staircase. This is one thing I've noticed in trying to kind of like sort of unravel this question, is that people start with, let's say everybody starts with like, let's say not caring about the environment. We're all like a blank slate when we begin. Okay, you first start to develop a bit of attitude, right? This is something that's studied in the academic literature. You start to think that, okay, I believe that like trees being alive is good. Someone might think that they really hate trees and they want them to be dead. But we start to believe that these are all good ideas and these are good things. And then they start to kind of bleed into the behaviors, right? You start to practice the behaviors. And then if they get a little bit more deeply rooted, then you'll start to maybe like talk to other people about it, try to do something in your office, maybe something with your neighbors. And so you're kind of like moving up this staircase or this scale. You might then do like a master's degree or a PhD in something. You might become an expert. You might start building things, like trying to build like a solar powered car or an invention or a device or a startup, moving up that kind of like mastery level. Some people might move into politics and they really try to be influential with policy. But we kind of start on this staircase. And like what I mentioned before, having like a split campaign, one that's for like your sort of deep green people that want to be active, purely based on trying to empower them to talk to other people. Another one for the beginners who aren't interested in doing that, is that all of these things are basically sort of meeting people on the staircase of where they're at. For some people, like if they get their native plant voucher, I mean, that could be like one of the first big kind of tipping points in their own psychology of getting them to be sort of pro-environmental. Or for somebody, it could be like, they could be really, really environmental already, and it's kind of late and they're like, already got all the native plants, the EV, the solar panel, already got a PhD on climate science. Like it's not going to be so useful for them. So a lot of these small actions and these small behaviors are really they're often hitting people that are potentially quite low on the staircase, and they're helping nudge them up the staircase to perhaps eventually being somebody who can, or at least supporting a movement of people that are doing like the really big, heavy hitting stuff, like trying to get gas stations closed down, coal power stations closed. Not everybody's going to be in that job doing that professionally, but all these little actions kind of like push the whole like tipping point forward. And it's all a staircase. Like, I think when people complain about individual action, I think it's kind of lame, because I think people who complain about individual action forget that they didn't get there all in one go. Did somebody who is like a vegan, had never heard about being vegan, never seen a vegan, never eaten a vegetable in their life, and then one day they completely woke up and all at once, it all just happened. Like, we all sort of some people have done it younger in life or later in life, but there's probably been years of marketing. And I mean, I don't mean marketing in the conventional sense. I just mean like social conversations you're seeing restaurants out, wherever. There's probably been like 10 years of that unconscious and conscious messages going in until someone's like, you know what, I think I might actually go vegan this year. They've been on their own early stage staircase where they got the top 10 green tips and the tofu burger, and they'd never seen green tips before. And they were like, green tips, what's this about? For someone else who was like way, way further down the staircase and is like so angry at the green tips, like, why are we making these green tips? Like, there's someone else who's like never heard of green tips, right? So kind of like segmenting like where people are at, and not designing like a one size fits all thing, but trying to like help people sort of where they're at on this staircase. And I think also like what you said about the staircase, I'll steal your like 2 times 10 times thing. You can take self-efficacy staircase, make a little Instagram thingy. But like you said that like a lot of like grassroots stuff coming up on the top down stuff happening. I don't know if like people necessarily realize, I'm meaning to do like a little graphic about this, that things start with like small groups of people, like the tipping point influencing like more groups of people. And then eventually somewhere along that, you'll get the systems change to happen. Like, the government's not going to put a whole lot of money in and change a whole lot of laws if there isn't already like a bit of a grassroots movement's already happening.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like necessary to have all of these early individual actions. Like, it's like a necessary fundamental ingredient of the systems change to have all this like small individual grassroots stuff going on, and all the little tiny eco actions, like they all kind of add up to sort of creating this movement, creating this consciousness, which will eventually, whenever they have like the city meeting or the law or all the people that do that policy work, they have like a community that's ripe and ready. They're like, wow, like 50% of our community is totally down for this. Why is 50% of the community down for it? Because everybody's been doing these little things for years.
Exactly.
Years.
I completely agree.
Anyway, these are things how I'm starting to understand it. Do you want to jump into academic definitions?
Sure.
Okay. I've got them all listed here. It might be a little bit of repetition, but we'll go through them all anyway. So we've been talking about diffusion behaviors, but just again, how do you define a diffusion behavior?
A diffusion behavior is an action in which an individual spreads some sort of information or behavior through their social network.
Okay, awesome. Like, and why don't you give like one environmental example? We've got native plants.
An example.
One. What about something different?
Other than plants? Okay. What do you mean? That's all I study. Let's see. So, solar panels. An individual action would be having solar panels on your house by yourself. The diffusion would be actually heading over to your neighbor's house and having a conversation with them about maybe your experience putting in your own solar panels, or maybe handing them a pamphlet that you got when you put them in. Just any kind of small action to kind of spread awareness or spread, hopefully, somebody else to take action, kind of influencing them to take action.
Okay, cool. And you talk a lot about going on from the value action gap and also the intention behavior relationship. Can you define what the value action gap is? I talk about it a lot, so listeners will probably know, but maybe not. And also branching into the intention behavior relationship.
So,
and also use a real life example so we understand.
Yes. I would say the value action gap is when you value something or you have a positive attitude towards something and you want to take action, but there is something that is keeping you from actually taking that action. So I will try to stay away from native plants. Hold on.
You don't need to totally stay away from native plants. That's unfair of me to ask you to do that. It's unfair. No, you use native plant examples because you know it really well. I noticed also in your study, everyone in your study is suffering from value action gap.
Oh, exactly. So somebody might be super excited about planting native plants and they might have super positive attitude, but there are specific things that might keep them away from actually doing it. And so there might be structural things. It could be a financial situation. Maybe they can't afford to redo their whole lawn because they just moved in and it was already pre-landscaped for them. Maybe it's HOA. Maybe they're not allowed to actually take out their grass. Maybe they rent and they can't do anything with their yard at all. And so there are different kinds of barriers that keep people from taking the action that they want to take. And it could be social. It could be that they don't think that their neighbors would support them in taking out their lawn because maybe everybody else in the neighborhood has a green grass lawn that they go out every Sunday and mow. And it's a cultural phenomenon in their neighborhood. And so I would say that there's this gap between what people want to do, and that this is kind of the same thing as the intention behavior gap. People say they want to do something, but there are just specific barriers that keep them from actually doing it. So for our study, we have this whole group of people that said they are very likely to do this. And when we physically gave them a coupon or 3 coupons to share with others, less than 10%, only 20, I think it was only like 28 people out of the however many coupons that we gave out, 600 coupons we gave out, only 20 of those vouchers were actually used. So there's this huge, in social psychology is kind of like flabbergasted by we study all of these things and people say that they're going to do it, but then they don't actually do it. And so something that I think is really important is that in social psychology literature, we need to actually be studying the real world behavior, because we need to start studying what is in that gap between actually the people saying that they want to do it versus what they're actually doing, and what is keeping people from doing it. And of course, I'm sure it's super complex of like, for some people it's a financial issue, for some people it's a social issue, or it's a combination of all of these different barriers. And so focusing on the barriers is something that I've been really trying to do with my work, specifically in the case study of native plant gardening. So that's why I have all these specific native plant gardening examples ready for you.
But it seems like you're being very generous with all of your examples, that it's like you've got these people that are just like desperate to do stuff, but there's this evil HOA that says no. And a lot of the time that's true. Like there's money and there's like things that are in the way. Like I'm really frustrated in my apartment. Like it's a rental. It's like all owned by one corporation. And like, there's like no way I can get an EV charger. Like I called up all the EV charging companies. I sent emails to the building manager. I'm not like allowed as a tenant to get introduced to the corporation. And it's just kind of like impossible. And if I got an electric car, I'd have to use the public chargers, which are kind of like hit or miss. And there's loads of Tesla chargers. But then I have to get a Tesla, which is like crazy expensive. And it's just like, it is totally systemically against me in every way. That's true sometimes, but from what I understand about the value action gap, it's not those situations. It's where people just like didn't get around to it. And like with the native plant voucher, all the people in your study that were like super excited to get their native plant voucher and give it to their friends, like not that many of them did it, but both individual get their own voucher or give the voucher away. Like there's no reason. There's no HOA in the way and no like $10,000 fee. It's just that people just don't necessarily do it.
I should have been more clear with the value gap. The value action gap is more so this like phenomenon of people saying they're going to do something and just not doing it. And there is bias in people wanting, it's social, wow, I'm blanking on the term right now. Oh, okay, I'm blanking on the term, but there's a bias where you want, social desirability bias, there we go, where you want to say that you're going to do something that you think that maybe the people who are giving you the study, or maybe what is socially accepted, you want to sound like you're going to do it, and you want people to think that you're a good person. So maybe there is an over-reporting of what people are actually going to do because they want to do it. They just, for some reason, don't get around to it. And then we see this huge gap in the literature of like, okay, we're doing everything we can to study this behavior, but people just aren't doing it. And so that's where I think that innovative kind of real world behavior measures like the vouchers are important, because it's not only a measure or indicator of people taking the action, but it also is an incentive to do it. You're getting $10 off a native plant. If that can't do it, what can? So just like trying to test different types of real world indicators, I think is needed specifically in our field. But it's kind of mind-boggling. We just keep seeing the same thing of this gap between what people say they want to do or what people believe in and what they actually do.
But with your vouchers though, so you gave out about 300 vouchers. Was there any way of telling how many of those got given to a friend? Because from what I understand, you could only really figure it out when they'd actually like turned up to get the plant. So it's quite likely that most of them could have given them away, and it was the people they gave them to. So we can not blame them. The people who like got the vouchers, they're like, it's not our fault, we gave them away. And then the person didn't show up. Like, could you test the quantity of people that gave them away and then the quantity of the receivers, how many they got their plant?
So for this preliminary study, that was a limitation that we had, where we were just studying the successful diffusion. So the people that gave the voucher, and then that voucher was actually used by the person they gave it to at the nursery that we were partnering with. So there's complexity there that we weren't able to study in that specific study, but we did in a follow-up study, we did the same voucher system, and we were asking people, who did you specifically give the voucher to? How many vouchers did you give? And we're still seeing that difference between what people say they want to do and what people are actually doing. The majority of people, and these were the motivated individuals, that this is a different study I'm talking about. The motivated individuals, they signed up for a native plant outreach workshop to learn how to be this social diffuser. Even those, like, it was astounding to see the low number of vouchers that were actually given away. So it's something that I've tried to wrap my head around within my dissertation work. But
did they have a buddy? Did they have a native plant giving voucher accountability buddy?
They did not have an accountability buddy. That is a great point. They did have people that they practiced with. A lot of people, when we said, hey, we're breaking out into Zoom sessions or breakout rooms in Zoom, people just left the chat or left the meeting because they didn't want to interact with people. And so, I mean, we gave people chances to like practice using their vouchers. We did all the things that I kind of talked about earlier in this conversation. And there was just still this like people, and we got feedback in kind of our open response questions of like, I love all the information about the native plants, but I don't understand why you were like trying to get me to preach this to other people. I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to tell other people what to do. And so that's just another barrier for social diffusion behavior specifically. And maybe that plays a role in this big gap that we're seeing between what people say they want to do and what they actually do. It's just that maybe people realize, oh, like I'm too introverted for this, or I don't have any friends, or like they give all of these excuses for why they didn't, because we asked them. So if you didn't share all your vouchers, why? And we're getting all of this qualitative data saying, I just don't feel like it's my place. I'm not that kind of person. And I think that kind of our individualistic society really plays a big role in that, of like people do what they want to do and you don't tell other people what to do. So there's this huge push back against social diffusion, I think, from what I'm seeing.
Who signed up though? This is what's crazy. So these are the people, they signed up for a native plant social diffusion, and then when they had the opportunity to do the diffusion action, they got cold feet and felt that they didn't know enough people.
Possibly. And maybe there's people that didn't realize that that's actually what they signed up for, and we got those responses. But it's even the native plant master gardeners, like some of them, most native plant master gardeners, that's kind of, they volunteer to tell other people about native plants. But for the people who are like, oh, I've been doing this for years in my yard, but that's where I draw the line. I just want to do it myself. And a lot of people say, my garden is enough. So just people walking by my garden is enough to kind of be the social diffusion. Like, it's the signaling that there is a native plant gardening in the neighborhood, which is, I would say, is a type of social diffusion. It's signaling. It's like putting a yard sign down, but we're trying to get at that a little more active type of behavior of actually having that conversation. And it's so funny, like, it's so simple, but it's so complicated at the same time.
It's not always simple though. Like, I do loads of like social marketing, and I have this big network all around the world of like cool, smart people. But where I live in Mountain View, like, I don't know that many people here. Like, I'm not from here. And for me to go and do social diffusion-y things is like genuinely intimidating. And I'm trying to like, master this professionally. I remember even like dropping my daughter off for school, and I'm like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be one of those like social diffusion people. I'm going to like know everybody and be on the PTA and like be a part of the local cities. And in my mind, I'll like get super networked. And then I drop my daughter off at school, and it's the day that they have something, and they call it like donuts and coffee with the principal or something. So they put all these tables outside at 8 o'clock in the morning, and there's all those big like boxes of coffee. They're like a wine thing, but they have coffee in them, and they have donuts. And then there's all these parents talking to each other, and I'm just like looking at them. It's like 8 in the morning, and I'm like, do it, go and talk. This is your chance. Like, make some friends, get some phone numbers. And then you'll be able to like sell them some solar panels, like practice what you preach, Katie. Go out there, mingle. It's part of the school. You're a parent. It's completely normal. You're expected to be there. And I was just really tired. I think I hadn't brushed my teeth, and I was just like, fuck it. Like, I'm just going home. Like, I just like, it was like, I knew it was like the prime opportunity to do exactly that. I'm like, to strangers, that I have nothing in common with, probably, maybe, I don't know, maybe I don't, I'm just making up, just assuming that I have nothing in common with these people, even though we have children and we live in the same place, we probably all work in technology. And I just got totally cold feet and just like went home. And it's just so easy to do that. Like people are shy, like naturally, and to be extroverted and talk to new people and make friends. Like it's a big, if you don't already have like some pre-existing big friend group, like this stuff on like a day-to-day level can be really, really hard. I mean, especially in America where people are moving around a lot, not just the individual culture, but growing up in Australia, we tend to stay more in the city that we're born in because there aren't that many cities to choose from. So usually in like Melbourne or Sydney, like one of the bigger cities, and then people live in the smaller cities too, but you're always near everybody you've ever known. So it's much easier. Yeah. I notice everybody has like much more sort of stronger and more rigid social networks, and rigid in the way that you can't get in and out of them so easily. People don't really want new people, but you also can't leave. It's like your family, like everybody you know from school is sort of like your tribe forever. It's kind of good and bad. But in America, everyone's just moving around like sort of Lego pieces, and you don't necessarily have that like pre-existing network to draw from. That's sort of a weird thing living here. Okay. Value action gap. We've dived into that a lot. What about diffusion personal norm? What does that mean?
Okay. So personal norm is kind of confusing because when you think about norms, you think of social norms. And so a social norm is something like you see a bunch of trash on the ground. And so you're thinking, oh, people just litter here. That's kind of the social norm. Or you're seeing the green grass lawns and you think, okay, lawns are what is the norm. With a personal norm, I think of it as a moral obligation. So it's a lot more personal. And there's this morality behind it of you ought to do this because it's the right thing to do. And this is pretty influential in the environmental world, just because a lot of the deep green people have this really strong personal norm that it is my moral responsibility to do this. And so when I add diffusion onto that, I would say that it's the belief that it is your moral obligation or responsibility to spread something through your social network. It's your obligation to motivate your family members to eat a more plant-based diet, that kind of thing. It's just this strong internal motivation.
I think when I was like 15, I was like that in a really, really annoying way. Like yelling, like, that chicken had to die. There's probably a lot of people who've been through the annoying environmentalist phase. Not that, okay. So a norm, when I think of a norm, I think it's like copying other people. But a personal norm is not anything to do with copying other people. It's just what I think is right. Like I'm really diehard about composting. I get really upset if someone doesn't puts organic matter in the trash. I don't care too much about recycling, but I really, really care about organic matter. And it's got nothing to do with what everyone else is doing. I really, really, like I'm not affected by what other people think of me doing this. It's intrinsic. So that's like a personal norm. Like it's not so much affected by the group.
I think of course everything is interrelated, but when in the social psychology literature, when somebody is talking about moral norm, it is that more intrinsic moral obligation. Sorry, personal and moral norm can be used interchangeably. There's so many different terms that are used by different people within our literature, and people are saying the same thing but just calling it slightly different names, so it gets really confusing. So personal norm is more intrinsic, but it is used in the literature.
Okay, so our job is we want to kind of like manufacture this sense of a diffusion personal norm. Like it's not just your responsibility to not litter. I would say like not littering and recycling are like really common personal norms. I think most people, even if you're not very heavily environmentally identified. We most think that littering is bad and recycling is right. They're pretty normal. So we want to kind of like manufacture a new personal norm to add this diffusion element. Like, okay, you want to get the solar power and the EV and like work in an interesting like social impact job. It's also part of that is that you actively go and like talk to people around you. That's like part of the kit of being like, and you don't just like hide away working on your startup or like just growing all your plants like on your own. Like it's sort of your duty to be out in your community, going to the coffee and donuts with the school principal in the morning and just like making friends and getting to know people and kind of like being a part of that. And also designing for it, doing it ourselves, but we've got to figure out like, how do we actually like kind of socially engineer this?
Another term that's related is moral exporting.
Well, that's a new one.
Different to moral licensing? I don't know.
Is it different to moral licensing?
I'm not sure. See, this is one of the issues, is why people don't understand environmental psychology, is there's so many terms that mean the same thing or mean a very similar thing, but there's not an agreed upon set of terms that we use. So moral exporting, I don't have a perfect definition in front of me, but it is along the lines of, you believe that you have a moral kind of responsibility to, I guess it's very similar. It's just not a term that I specifically used in that study. Honestly, I can just.
Oh, wait, so you feel that you have a responsibility to morally export your values onto kind of everyone around you?
Yes.
I definitely have that. My whole career is trying to influence people to be greener.
Exactly.
But I'm pretty chill about it on a personal level. Like, I don't really like just sort of like being a dick. Like, you know how some greenie people can be like really condescending and like sort of morally, I hate that. Like, I'll always be really nice to people individually and not make a big deal about it. Like if somebody littered in front of me, I'd be like if they were like a friend, like somebody I knew, I'd be just like, oh, let's just not do that now. I wouldn't like freak out. But anyway, I'm just going off topic. Okay, so that's moral exporting.
It's just trying to influence the behaviors of other people, really, is moral exporting.
Okay. So moral licensing is kind of like the opposite of the spillover effect. That's like where you do something really green and then you do something like, and that gives you an excuse to be like ungreen.
Oh.
And it does come up, like it's real. Like you've got like both things going on, like one green thing leads to another green thing. And then you've got like if you put a campaign to get everybody to save water, they suddenly start using more electricity. Like really good things like that. You're just like, really? Like you wouldn't think they'd be connected, but everybody's like focused on the water. So they're just kind of like, oh, well, I just saved all this water. It's probably even unconscious. Like I saved all this water, so I'll just take a really long shower. I'll just like, I don't know, use more of the heater now or something. Cool. Okay. So where are we at now? I thought this idea of like the social sanction is interesting also. Social sanction when it comes to environmental stuff, like what is that?
So social sanctions are really people reacting negatively to your actions. And so when we get into more social behaviors like social diffusion or encouraging somebody to do something, there's this possibility that somebody is going to react negatively, or they're not going to necessarily be on the same page as you, and that can be awkward, that can be uncomfortable for people. So I think we were really hypothesizing that this idea of injunctive norms, and I'm getting really jargony here, just social norms.
Wrap it in. Injunctive norms, social sanctions.
Yep. So injunctive norms or subjective norms, again, they're used interchangeably, is the idea that other people, other important people around you, will either support you or not disapprove of you doing something. And so we ask people in our surveys, if I were to talk to somebody about native plant gardening, would other people disapprove of me doing that? And so we were really curious because we thought social sanctions would be really relevant for social diffusion behaviors because it's inherently social. And we didn't necessarily see that as a predictor in this paper, but more qualitatively, we have seen people saying that I don't want to have a conversation with my neighbors because I don't think that they'll agree with me, or because in the past, my neighbor has told me that my native plants look like weeds. So I'm not about to go up to them and encourage them to try to plant plants that maybe look like that. So social sanctions are really just negative reactions from others that we are assuming are going to happen. They may or may not actually happen.
Do you think that the perceived social sanctions are worse than the reality of the social sanctions? I think I had another guy on my podcast. It was actually the most popular of all the podcasts. He had some really interesting thoughts on that.
I do think that the perceived social sanctions are, in somebody's mind, more extreme than what you'll actually find when you go out into the real world, because there is this, and I'll add in another term for you, something that I love to talk about is pluralistic ignorance.
Oh, that's what he did. Jan, you probably know his work.
I'm sure. So the idea that you believe that other people around you don't have the same values or attitudes or beliefs that you do, when in reality it's a misconception. The reality is a lot of the times you actually are in the majority of people that believe or think a certain way, but there might be a very vocal minority of people that are saying that, for example, the belief in climate change. So we know that a majority of people believe in climate change, and I'm putting the believe in quotations with my fingers. But there might be a really vocal majority of people, maybe in your community or that you see on the news, that is saying that not a lot of people believe that this is really a thing. So that is actually going to cause you to self-silence. So when you believe that the people around you aren't going to behave the same way as you, think the same way as you, then you're actually, like, the more you think that, the more you're actually going to silence yourself and be less likely to engage in a discussion about climate change. And so that's where this kind of efficacy piece comes up again, of like, you can do it. There are people around you that do believe in what you believe in. And in that piece, and we actually, this is something that we did in a different study, is we addressed pluralistic ignorance head on. We told people, this is what it is. This is a common phenomenon. But in fact, people will not necessarily react in a super negative way. They actually are probably going to agree with it, and you don't even realize it.
And what happened with that study?
So I am currently in the process of submitting it to a journal. But so these are the workshops that I alluded to earlier. So we had these workshops. We had one workshop where we just gave everybody the information and didn't necessarily try to influence any kind of social influence or efficacy, any of these interventions that we're studying. And then the other one, we added in like specific information about what other people are doing, specific ways to kind of build people up and address that pluralistic ignorance, and have the people practice their conversations with other people and practice their voucher sharing. And we actually didn't have a big enough difference between the two groups in terms of behavior, what people said they would do and what people actually did with their voucher usage. But we did see that the workshop where we did have those interventions, it did actively influence some of those perceptions around the behavior that are hopefully going to influence that behavior in the future. Maybe it didn't happen right away, and maybe there need to be more interventions that happen along the way for people to actually change their behavior. But we were able to measure that those interventions were changing some of those perceptions that have been tied to social diffusion behavior and individual behavior in general.
I mean, it might just take like a bit of trial and error or like a little bit of practice. You know, if somebody hears that for the first time, they may not suddenly just like break out of their shyness and be able to be able to do it. They might need a few like a bit more sort of like runs on the wheel of doing it once they know that exists. I had a really interesting example with that. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's like a little bit related. When I was like doing the cool block sort of like walk around with my real estate agent friend, like the particular like block that we did, I had like super low expectations for. Like all the houses just look like cookie cutter houses. We know from her real estate, she has a website, that they're all rentals. Like I'm like, these are all just like transient like technology people. Like I was only doing it just for practice. Like I'm like, we've got to go over to the nice family homes where everybody's got a Tesla and rose gardens and sunflowers. Like we're going to walk across the bridge and we'll do like the real community houses where I feel like we'll get somewhere. But in about like just a not very long doing it, like I had these like really long conversations with like 3 different people who were really cool, people I would be friends with. One of them was like an environmental manager at like the city. She had like a guitar up and like incense burning. It was like such a total like environmental science school kind of person. And a few other people that had like similar work in technology were like really cool. And I was like, oh my God, this is like really cool people that I would totally be friends with if I was like met them at a party. Just in my like sort of not very glamorous little corner of these cookie cutter, not exciting homes. And I had a bunch of people really interested in doing more like environmental active stuff. And I really didn't try very hard. And so I was expecting it to be complete like garbage. I was like, this is going to suck. Like, this is going to be terrible. I'm only doing this as practice. But it was actually like really, really good. And my little community nearby was so much more friendly and open than I was like expecting. There's not environmental behavior exactly, but it probably could be pretty closely related to just like having a negative assumption of what it's going to be, and then it actually being much more positive than it was. Although I do have to say, I had the opposite of that experience. So when I was 16, I went to a private school, and I'm not sure if it had anything to do with the private school actually, but I was like super like environmental activist-y when I was a teenager. And we had this like sort of like it was like the morning news, like a bulletin that got read out in all the classrooms. And I just asked the school principal if I could put like an environmental fact, because I used to read like science magazines all the like I like these little like nuggets, factoid nuggets. So it was the equivalent to like a tweet, I suppose, like before the internet existed, just like a little fact. But they were like super negative. But I personally never found them negative. I just thought, I was like, wow, do you know that like mercury is killing penguins? I just found this really interesting. I kind of find it emotionally negative in that sense. And I tell you what, the school hated me. Like I was like totally ridiculed. The teachers like asked me to stop. People would yell out at me at the playground, like just randomly, like, stop doing it. We hate it. It's depressing. And the whole thing was, even the teachers asking me to stop, they said, it's really depressing. We don't want to know about it because it's depressing. I'm like, don't you want to know that if you eat like charred meat, it has like, it's full of carcinogens? They'd be like, and one teacher, she literally said to me, she said, Katie, I love charred meat. I don't want to read at 8 o'clock in the morning that charred meat is going to give me cancer. I'm like, really? It was profoundly negative for me, socially, really bad. And nobody ever said anything good about it. Like nobody was like, wow, that was really interesting. I loved learning about it. It was just a huge negative backlash. And I think I did it for like 3 months. And then I went into a deep depression and finished high school and it was over.
Oh no. I think the framing around, and this isn't my expertise in message framing specifically for climate change, but there has been a lot of work done of kind of trying to craft more positive messages rather than the the doom and gloom of the past messages that we've been. And I think the building, the empowering or the building of efficacy or confidence really plays along in that piece of like you can do it. And I know I'm not saying it's simple to actually do it, but it might be simpler than we think to just focus on building people up and building people's confidence. It's a simple idea, is what I should say. It's a lot goes into actually building confidence, as we've seen in the education world of building up students' confidence in math abilities or something like that. But just kind of trying to stay positive and trying to empower people to go out into their own community. And it doesn't have to be a stranger. It could be their parents or their siblings or their friends. So it's such a complex issue, but there's so many different ways to go about it. And this study is just looking at a very, very, very specific.
Well, this is why it's so cool to talk
area.
about it, because the study is like, studies are all kind of a little bit hard to understand and they're specific, but when we have a conversation, it always like blossoms out. Like if you've done a study, you're so knowledgeable about so much more that you can express than just like this little thing.
Yes.
But that's cool that like efficacy is about, it's about confidence. Like if you're coming as an environmental program designer away from, well, my example when I was 16, I was doing the fact thing. I was putting facts every morning in the newsletter, a negative fact. People hated it and hated me as well. Anyway, so 25 years later, as a behavior designer, obviously I've moved on since then. We want to give people, we don't want to give people environmental facts. We want to give people the confidence to get over their insecurity and their shyness of talking to other people, which is how profoundly different is that a lens? Like to take a person who's too shy to talk to their neighbors, who's worried they're going to get in trouble, who like, I mean in trouble in a very big context. Like if they talk to their neighbor about a native plant, like that the neighbor is going to get mad at them. Like that's the emotional space that we're working with. Like that is a profoundly different space to be working with. And like, let's shoot environmental facts at you.
The information, I will say, and the knowledge is an important background piece. Like you have to have a baseline amount of knowledge and information to actually have that conversation. But yes, when we're looking at like the nitty-gritty, how to get those people that are already doing the individual action, how do you get them to take one extra step up that staircase? And it may seem silly, but it's building their confidence to have that conversation. So, and it is a really different space. It wasn't just you back then doing the negative facts. That was what was being done, and that is still what is being done. It was
the 90s. It's the 90s. It was all like that.
And it is changing, but I think it's really exciting that it is changing, because it is a lot more fun to talk about when you're building people up rather than sharing the doom and gloom of what will happen to our species and all of the other species on our planet.
It's definitely more fun being a gamification designer now than it was back then, before, when it was all just the planet's going to die, capitalism is destroying us, and a lot of like grunge metal, like really intense, dark grunge metal music. All right, we should probably wrap up. Otherwise, I'm going to be editing for a very, very long time.
Yes.
As much as I love to keep talking about this, how are we going to finish up our conversation? Okay, I'll just ask you one more question to refine causality, the future, and then your vision in 100 years. So we'll try to do like a snappy little ending from there. Okay.
Okay.
So the purpose of looking into all this research so we can be better environmental designers is really understanding causality and the causal mechanism of change. How would you define what you really think the causal mechanism of change is with people influencing each other?
The causal mechanism.
Like, what's the real cause? Like, why? It's that real sort of deeper why of the human brain, the nervous system, the neuroscience, like the way we work as a society, of why this is happening. Because when we understand the causal mechanism, we can then work from this primary principle and then design up from there.
Mm-hmm. Can you repeat the last part of the question again? I've already.
Oh, maybe it's like not, maybe it's too hard to answer. I'm not explaining.
I mean, people are inherently social beings, and I think human nature comes from our social interactions, and we can see how important those social interactions are just from living in this pandemic. That I think it and I might not be answering your question really, but it just makes sense that fostering social interactions with people is going to be inherently effective at creating social movements and creating larger changes to complex issues like climate change, or what I'm focusing on of biodiversity loss. And so building or designing ways to make people feel comfortable having those social interactions I think can only lead to more positive changes in the future. Not sure if that answered your question.
Well, humans are social. We rely on social connection. Social connection is everything. So social connection should be the medium in which we're designing from, I think. Basically, is the way I see the sort of causal mechanism of this.
Okay.
And
great.
What are you most excited to keep researching, to expand from in the future with your research?
I mean, speaking of causal effects in psychology specifically, I think that the studies around this specific paper that we're talking about today, we've done 2 field experiments. I think experimental research is one path that I would love to continue on, but I think is super important in the environmental social science world, because we have all of these correlational surveys and studies saying like these things are related. But if we're going to design for programs and initiatives, we need to have specific steps that we can take that are going to actually cause a change. The other aspect of my work that I'm really interested in pursuing is this link between pro-environmental action, or maybe just being in nature, and human well-being, and actually emphasizing that one can't really be without the other. And I think it's a newer direction that people are public health is reaching into the environmental world, and the environmental world is reaching into public health. But I would love to continue studying that inherently linked connection and kind of try to bring those 2 together to really have it as more of a common phenomenon, that environmental health equals human health, and humans and environment cannot be taken apart from one another. And that's the reason why we're studying humans, because environmental issues are human issues.
They are. It's amazing how many people don't necessarily like the penny doesn't drop for them for that. I'm like evolution, human lungs, kind of same thing. Cool. And if you could go 100 years in the future and see our sustainability movement doing everything with the gold standard, having certain things happen, what would you really like to see have happen? But particularly, in the environmental psychology, environmental practitioner world, not the whole world as a whole.
I think I would love to see environmental managers or environmental psychologists or researchers really emphasizing diverse perspectives in their work, in both their research and their programming. And that means taking more participatory approaches to make sure that different kinds of worldviews and different types of knowledge systems are in place to make sure that these initiatives are going to be effective for not just the people in power, but for more people than are kind of it's historically included in the environmental movement. I think that leveraging social influence and the power of Block leaders is a part of it, and then building that confidence both within the individual and within the group. So the confidence that I can do it, and the confidence that me as part of this team or as part of this group of people can actually make a difference in a positive way.
It sounds like it's the quest before us is about confidence and belief that you can do it, belief that people will be receptive to it, belief that it won't be uncomfortable. And this is where all this self-efficacy and confidence comes into this quite new and interesting psychological realm for our work.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm excited more about it since talking to you, because I've done a lot of work in like optimism and talking about creativity and having a vision and all of that kind of stuff. But this conversation has really like got me interested. What am I saying? What am I trying to say? Interested. Really curious about this concept, this new word of belief, which was a few times in the paper. You've got to believe that you can do it, believe that people are going to respond to you, and be confident, which gives you the efficacy to actually just go out and do it.
It's not everything, but it's an important piece of the puzzle that I think needs more research on, and it needs to be implemented both experimentally on the research side and within the environmental manager, just trying to test out, maybe I'll add this into my next workshop or my next community meeting, of actually focusing on how can I lift people up and help them believe in themselves and the group.
I'm curious as well, because there's plenty of people that do this in other fields that need to confidence and all that kind of stuff. It exists everywhere. We got to maybe hire some of those people that do that sort of thing. For, I don't know, rock stars, actors, how do they become so confident? Sports people, they've got it all figured out. We can figure it out too. Okay, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was delightful having you on today and being able to take such a deep dive into the nuances of all these topics.
Thank you so much for hosting me on your podcast. It's really been a pleasure, really diving into self-efficacy and all of the interesting new directions that we can have in this field.